how it looks now. And so basically, the two things that have changed a lot is where there used to be huge fields of open sand up there, just like that expanse of white open sand is now completely filled in by houses with vegetated dunes in front of them. And same here, this is actually Cape Kiwanda. If you've been out there to like Pelican Brewing, oh, the mic's a lot louder there. If you've gone out to that area and seen there's a ton of development now all along that strip of beach, and in some places there's vegetated dunes in front of it. In some cases, the structures go pretty much all the way out to the beach. But to give you some sense of how much the landscape has changed in the past several decades and the extent to which these grasses have spread. And these grasses don't just stabilize sand, but they're actually ecosystem engineers. And so they've drastically changed the landscape of dune ecosystems where they've been introduced. So what happens is sort of you get this positive feedback loop where sediment supplies, so wind that blows sand up the beach and into the dune grasses, will bury that vegetation. These grasses actually like getting buried to some extent, and so they'll grow more and vigorously. And then more sand gets blown up and buries them, and then they grow more. And so this positive feedback loop over time, over years and decades, will build a really large dune where there's previously only maybe a small hummock. And so that has had drastic implications for, again, the landscape itself, the topography of the dunes, but also the native flora and fauna that used to live there and that are trying to live there still. And so one thing that's really interesting is the different species of grasses actually build different sizes and shapes of dunes. So on the left over here, or on the left part of this right panel, Ammophila arenaria, the European beach grass, tends to have a lot of vertical growth. It grows tall and it has really dense stems. And so as it gets buried by sand, it traps a lot of that sand and tends to build dunes that are very tall, but sort of narrow in the cross-shore direction. In the middle there, you can see Ammophila breviligulata. This is the dune grass native to the East Coast and the Great Lakes. That grass has more lateral growth. It sort of spreads out rather than growing straight up. And it traps a little bit less sand. It tends to build dunes that are a little shorter, but broader. They're wider in that cross-shore direction. And then finally, on the far right, we have our native grass, Laemus mollis. And it does have lateral growth, but really, really low stem densities. And so it doesn't trap very much sand. It's not really capable of building a tall dune, really just small, short hummocks, like you saw in that first black and white photo. And so these different types of dune formation is a really, really interesting part of how these grasses have changed dune ecosystems. So that if you go to the coast in Oregon or Washington today, you'll see something like this, just like what we see at South Beach. Right out here is that instead of this wide open expansive field of sand with lots of bare sand moving around, you have one really large shore parallel ridge of sand that's been stabilized and dominated by one or more non-native grasses. And so I want to switch gears a little bit now into thinking about not just the history of these sand dunes in the Pacific Northwest, but the ecosystem services that they provide. And one of the big ones that people all around the world who live near or behind sand dunes think about is coastal protection. And so dunes act as sort of this natural barrier between development or communities or where folks live or recreate and any sort of hazard that might be there from the ocean. So whether that's storm surges or hurricanes or erosion or sea level rise, anytime there's a high water event that comes up, a dune acts as a barrier to protect whatever's behind it. Another ecosystem service provided by dunes is recreation. So all of us, I'm sure all of you, especially if you live out here and get to spend all your time on days that are, I'm sure, always as beautiful and sunny as today, get to go out to the coast and play in the sand or walk your dog or go surfing or whatever it is. And so that's a really important service as well. And finally, providing habitat for endangered or native flora and fauna. And so that includes the pink and yellow sand verbenas that I showed a picture of earlier, and also the adorable but endangered western snowy plover. So these ecosystem services, coastal protection, recreation, and habitat are really important services that dunes provide. But one service we often don't think about in sand dunes is carbon storage. A lot of people would look at a dune and say it's just a big pile of sand. There's probably no carbon in there. And so there's really not been a lot of study about carbon storage in dunes, despite the fact that climate change is still happening, that there's too much carbon in the atmosphere, and that our understanding of ecosystems' ability to sequester and store that carbon in plant biomass and in soils is actually a really, really important thing that's crucial to us understanding global carbon cycles and the potential for ecosystems to buffer or mitigate climate change. And so I want to now zoom from ecosystem services more broadly, specifically to carbon storage. And so coastal ecosystems in general are really, really good at storing carbon. On the right here, you can see these coastal systems like salt marshes, mangroves, and seagrasses sequester an order of magnitude more carbon per area per year than even terrestrial forests. So way, way more carbon per year on a per area basis than even like the giant forests that we have in the Pacific Northwest. And the reason that coastal ecosystems are able to do this is they have two mechanisms to do it. So any terrestrial ecosystem like a grassland or a forest has one mechanism, which I'm calling green carbon, which is basically the ability to photosynthesize. So as plants are growing, they are pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere, fixing it into their tissues, and then sometimes pumping those as sugars into the soil to feed microbes, or as their bodies sort of start to decay and break down, that carbon goes into the soil that way. So this is all based on primary production or on the photosynthesis of the plants there. And coastal ecosystems can do that, check. They also, though, which is unique to coastal ecosystems, have the ability to import blue carbon, or carbon that's sort of coming from the marine environment. And so carbon that's produced in other ecosystems, but that gets delivered by water or by wind, it can accumulate sort of over time in ecosystems like mangroves, seagrass beds, or salt marshes. And so that's part of why we see that there's higher carbon sequestration and higher carbon storage per unit area in these systems. Dunes have both of these mechanisms, and yet we know very little about how much capacity they have to store carbon. And that's also despite the fact that dunes make up a huge portion of the world's coastlines. So those other three coastal systems, salt marshes, estuaries, mangroves, all together make up a very small percentage of the world's coastlines, less than 6%, whereas dunes alone make up over a third of the world's ice-free coastlines. And so these percentages are showing the percent of each continent's shorelines that are made up of sandy beaches. And so this is a really sort of ubiquitous global ecosystem, and there's only a few papers that have come out of Europe, that tiny part up there, that have even looked at the potential for dunes to store carbon. And so this is a really, really sort of understudied thing. I think it's very important that we sort of understand and look into this. And the Pacific Northwest is a really great place to do that because of the history of how these non-native grasses have been introduced and the consequences that might have. I often do talk in circles, so you're probably wondering why is he showing us the same plot again, but this is intentional. So we kind of know about the history of the Northwest here now. We're thinking about the mechanisms of carbon storage. And I want to go back to this because not only is our dunes potentially getting imported carbon from the sand and sediment being delivered up from the ocean, but the process of dune formation is a process of burying grasses as they're growing. So those grasses grow really dense, get buried by sand, grow more, get buried. What happens to those grasses? Do they decay immediately? Do they stay as organic carbon in the system? It's something that I'm thinking about a lot as a way of potentially boosting the amount of carbon in these dunes. And again, because the different species of grasses build different sizes and shapes of dunes, this could impact carbon storage through both mechanisms, through the primary productivity of the ecosystem, basically, how much are different species growing, how efficient carbon fixers are they? Is there more biomass or higher stem density for certain species? But also that other mechanism of sort of the blue carbon, how much can it import, would also be impacted by the species that are growing there. Because if they're building dunes that have a really large volume or very small volume, that volume component is crucial to the total carbon stock in an ecosystem as well. And so wanted to highlight that on this figure again. So with all that in mind, I'll go over basically sort of the questions from my first dissertation chapter, which is how much carbon is stored in Pacific Northwest coastal sand dunes. And I'm going to think about this starting very small and sort of zooming out. So primarily, or first of all, how does carbon change with the depth? So as we go down in the dune, do we see any patterns with carbon density that way? As we move from the shoreline, sort of across the beach, up and over the dune, and towards like a dune forest or a later successional stage? How does carbon vary in that direction? And then finally, how does carbon storage vary by site? So across the Pacific Northwest from Southern Oregon to Southern Washington. And so the way that I did this is went out in the summers of 2020 and 2021 to 47 transects in Oregon and Washington, as you can see here. The ones marked in red, I'm calling unmanaged, which doesn't mean that they're not part of some sort of coastal management plan. It just means that for the past many decades at that location, the Ammophila grasses have had sort of free range to grow and spread however they will. And in blue, it says HRA, that's Habitat Restoration Area. Those are places where various agencies have graded down the dune to a lower elevation and tried to either chemically and or mechanically sort of remove the Ammophila grasses to restore that habitat to something closer to what it had been before colonization. And the priorities there are often to create habitat for endangered flora, such as the pink sand verbena, the picture I showed earlier, and also to create habitat for nesting shorebirds like the endangered snowy plover. And so I have 38 transects that are in this unmanaged area, 9 in the habitat restoration areas. And I also kind of broke them down into regions, which will make more sense when I show some of my results later. But I have 3 of the habitat restoration areas in Washington. I have 3 of them in Northern Oregon and 3 in Southern Oregon, just to sort of give you a sense of the breakdown here. And I'll refer back to this map when I'm talking about different sites. And so at each of these transects, we went out and collected 4 main types of data. The first is trying to understand the dune morphology. So the size and shape of the dune. And what that does is sort of tells us what volume of ecosystem are we working with. And so we put on this, this real-time kinematic GPS backpack. We walk a transect from the shoreline, across the beach, up and over the dune, and basically keep walking until we hit the end of grassy vegetation. So when the Ammophila stops and some form of coastal dune forest begins, or in a couple cases, until you run into someone's front yard, because there's a whole line of houses right there. And so basically what we're trying to do is capture what is the whole like regional extent of grassy vegetated dunes at all of these places. And you can see here, there's a lot of variation in the size of the dunes. This first picture on the left, there's hardly any dune that's in Grayland, Washington. The dunes there are very, very wide, very, very flat. There's hardly any elevation change versus this one on the right, which is at Sand Lake, Oregon, and the dunes are over 20 meters tall there. So really, really big changes in the morphology of the dunes. And what we do is we want to get some sort of profile, which ideally would look something like this, and we can sort of see, okay, this is what the shape of that dune was like. And in reality, it looks a little bit messier, but this is some of the data we get from walking that line. And we can get metrics from this, like what we call the toe of the dune, sort of the beginning of the dune face. What do we call the crest, the highest point? Where's the heel or the back? And what was the beach slope or the beach width? Or because we've gone to a lot of these transects for over 10 years in my lab, we have some sort of short-term change rates of, is this particular site accreting sand? Is it eroding? Is the dune getting taller or narrower? And so that can tell us a little bit too about what's happening at each of these places. The second type of data that we collect is vegetation density and composition. And so along that transect running from the shoreline, all the way up and over the dune, every 5 meters we'll put a quadrat down and measure basically all the species that are there and the density that they occur. And so we can sort of see how that changes as well along that gradient of ecological succession, moving from the toe of the dune all the way back. And as you can see, in some places, it's like a jungle in there. It's really, really dense grass. You have to kind of like get down and crawl through it, and counting a single quadrat could take an hour. The second part of the vegetation component is collecting that vegetation and being able to get essentially biomass per plant for each species. So if we know the density of plants that's growing in that area, and we also know how much carbon is in that particular type of plant on average, then we can get an above ground carbon stock estimate and see how that changes again as we move from the toe of the dune beyond. And then finally, to estimate the below ground carbon, we took sediment cores. And so at the toe, crest, heel, and back, so 4 places along each transect, we took one of these sediment cores, and it's essentially a 4-inch diameter PVC pipe that's like 1.5 meters long. And we just use a good old-fashioned sledgehammer to smack that thing right into the dunes. And we would go 1 meter deep, so we can see 1 meter down into the dune. And then generally try to pull it out without disturbing any other part of the dune using this jack. So we kind of hoist it back out slowly and capture all that sand and be able to move on with our lives. That was extremely optimistic because sand, unlike sediment that other people try to take cores of, sand is really dry sometimes and it will just crumble out of the bottom and you cannot get it to stay in the core. Like the first year of my PhD was figuring out how to keep sand in tubes. It was very silly. But if we can't always pull the sand up to us, sometimes we have to go down to the sand by digging these big holes. And I feel like I got to sort of relive one of my favorite childhood movies, Holes, where I was just like, okay, I guess this is how we get the sand out. And maybe we'll get better at using that jack. Maybe we'll be able to pull the tubes out. And just every day for those first 2 summers, it was like, I think this is something we're just going to have to keep doing. And my field crew was really patient. They were a lot of fun doing this field work with me. And I think eventually we all had to embrace that digging these holes was just part of the experience of measuring carbon in dunes. And we tried to really embrace that zero mentality. So that was a lot of fun for me. And I'll definitely miss doing that field work as I approach the end of my dissertation. But eventually we get those tubes out of the dunes. We usually take it back to our campsite and we have to extrude the sand back out. So we have a custom designed extruder that mounts to the back of a pickup truck. And basically what it does is uses a different kind of jack to push the sand out of the tube. And we collect it in 5 centimeter intervals all the way down to 1 meter. And so that gives us that depth profile of what is the carbon density, how does it change throughout that depth column. And so you can see the samples sort of kept in these baggies right here. And so each bag is a 5 centimeter puck of sand that came out of the tube. Just to give you a sense of what actually it looks like in those cores, there's actually a lot of organic matter in there. So these grasses, especially sort of in the heel and in the back of the dune where they're growing really, really dense, there's a lot more biodiversity. You're sort of almost at that transition to coastal forest. There's a lot of biomass underground there. And so we get these big, just matted wads of roots and rhizomes, which is really cool to see. And occasionally we were shocked to hit something underground that would either shatter our core tubes, or if we were lucky, be able to capture it in the extrusion process. But we would go through driftwood. You all have seen driftwood out of the coast. It's a really important part of the process of dune formation. And so sometimes the logs would either be too big or too hard, and it would just break the cores, which is a sad day for me. Or if it was in an advanced enough state of decay, it would be really spongy. And it was really weird to feel as we were pounding the cores in, we hit something, but it's still going down. So we'll try it. And to be able to pull out these solid pucks of wood, which definitely influenced the carbon stock of dunes. And I'll talk about that a little bit later, but it's not the main part of my work here. So we get back to the lab, separate out the below ground biomass from the sediment. So basically use this 2 millimeter sieve and take out all the roots, rhizomes, driftwood, shells, anything large. And then we would know sort of the fraction of organic matter that's in that below ground biomass. We already measured the above ground. And now finally with that below ground sediment, so everything that's smaller than 2 millimeters, the sand particles, tiny bits of detritus, et cetera, from there, we would do this process called loss on ignition, which is a way to measure organic matter. You basically mix up your sediment really, really well, homogenize it, put a little bit of it into these really cute little teacups called crucibles, and then you just burn it really, really hot for a couple hours. And the difference in mass before and after is presumed to be organic matter that was combusted while it was in the oven. And so this is a way to tell us how much organic matter is in the sample. And in order to make sure that we had a really good, basically trying to use that organic matter measurement as a proxy for organic carbon. Being able to burn things in an oven is really cheap and easy. Measuring carbon precisely is a little bit harder. So we took some subsample and did element analysis, carbon and nitrogen with those samples to create a regression and make sure that we have a really good relationship between the organic carbon we're measuring with element analysis and the organic matter measurements of loss on ignition technique. Again, because doing this loss on ignition is so much easier and we're talking about so many samples, that's kind of the easiest metric for us to use. And so we felt really good about this. We have R squared of 0.84. And so now we're ready to share some results of how much carbon is actually in dunes. And again, like I said, when I sort of shared my research question, I was like, I'm going to start really small and we're going to zoom out a little bit as we go. So this is just looking at a single core. This is actually at Sand Lake, Oregon, just north of here. And so we're looking at a single core at the toe of the dune. And what you're looking at is percent LOI, or percent organic matter in the sand, as we go from the surface on the left to a meter deep on the right. And what you can see is at the toe of the dune at this particular place, A, there's very little organic matter, and B, that doesn't change very much as you go down the depth of the dune, or down the depth of the core, excuse me. And so now I'm going to sort of show the other cores at this transect, the crest, the heel, and the back. And one thing you notice right away is that, okay, as you move up and over the dune towards these more densely vegetated areas, as we would predict, we see more carbon there in the below ground. And there's generally a pattern where you have higher organic matter at the surface. And as you go to the right, as you go deeper and deeper into the dune, we see kind of a drop off of organic matter, but these spikes that sort of happen irregularly all the way down. And this is something that's really interesting to see, but again, not entirely surprising. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in a couple slides. But again, things to note is that we have an increase in organic matter as we go from the toe of the dune to the back, and generally a decrease as we go from the surface down, but with these irregular patterns of increases because of clumps of roots and rhizomes. So this is just what's in the sediment. I'm now going to show the top panel, which is the same exact transect. And this is looking about the amount of solid, large pieces of below ground biomass at the same place. And we see there's a pretty good sort of correlation between the amount of big pieces of biomass at each depth interval and the amount of organic matter in the sediment itself as we go down into the core. So again, this is just one individual transect. We have a sense of how much carbon is in there, what the pattern is, and now we're going to zoom out a little bit into trying to figure out the carbon density at an entire transect. And so what I'm showing here is we have one transect still. This is in Grayland Harbor, so this is in southern Washington. And these bars are showing the carbon density in kilograms of organic carbon per meter squared for the above ground biomass, or you can think of it as cubic meters for the below ground biomass. And the yellow is showing what fraction of that carbon is stored in the sediment. The brown is what fraction of that is stored in the roots and rhizomes. And then the green is showing what fraction of that was actually the above ground sort of, plant leaves and stems. And so one thing to note here, right, is that over half of the carbon at least is in the sediment itself. Whatever we see in terms of the grassy vegetation, when you look at a dune, that's sort of the tip of the iceberg in terms of organic carbon stored in that ecosystem. There's much, much more below it underground. And even underground, the majority of it is not actually in the roots themselves. It's in that small, fine sort of particulate organic matter that's breaking down and mixing in with the sand. And we see an increase again as we move from the toe of the dune towards the back. So now I'm going to show the rest of the transects in Washington. And there's this map along the right-hand side, so you can sort of see which section of sites I'm talking about. So this is all of our transects in Washington. The ones in red are the red background here are sort of correlating with the red unmanaged sites over there. And the blue background here is because it's a habitat restoration area. And so one thing that you note right away is that at the habitat restoration area, we see pretty similar amounts of sort of the sand carbon density. These yellow bars are pretty similar, but there's definitely less of the below ground biomass. There's less carbon in that sort of pool than there is at these comparison sites. So these sites on the right along the Long Beach Peninsula in Washington are sort of comparison sites against that habitat restoration area. It's pretty interesting to see. Moving a little bit further down the coast, we're now looking at northern Oregon. So this is everywhere just south of the Columbia River, all the way down to, where is this site? Nehalem Bay on the far right over here. And again, it's really interesting to see this pattern of more carbon as we move towards the back of the dune, and a less clear picture in terms of the habitat restoration area. So these three transects here with the blue background are the habitat restoration areas in Nehalem, and compared to sort of their reference sites, these three with the white background in Nehalem, only one of them actually has a lot lower carbon. And one of the things we think are happening here is that restoration site was set up much more recently than the other ones. And so if those dunes were graded and they haven't been putting in as much effort over the same amount of time to remove the Ammophila grasses, maybe there's still some residual organic carbon at those transects. Moving a little bit further south now, so this is our Central Oregon sites. Again, we see a lot of the same patterns. It's really interesting to me, the consistency but within a site. So all of the transects at Sand Lake, for instance, have pretty similar estimates of carbon density. And we see that at all these sites, except for this one in Pacific City. And so this transect in Pacific City happens to be the only transect that I actually measured where the hybrid beach grass has sort of started to take over there. The hybrid mostly grows in southern Washington, but there's one random patch that was smack dab on our transect. And at those places, we tend to see higher carbon storage at that place than the other two transects in Pacific City, which is really interesting. Obviously, it's a one-off, it's not a clear pattern, but it's definitely something to think about as this hybrid continues to spread throughout the Oregon and Washington coast. And then finally, our southernmost sites are shown here. And the habitat restoration area in the southern sites is at Dunes Overlook. So these ones with the blue background, their three reference transects are these ones with the white background at Siltcoos, Oregon. And there's a really, really clear pattern here. The habitat restoration areas in southern Oregon have been around much longer and are maintained sort of with much more regularity. And we see this really clear pattern where the carbon density is significantly lower here than the reference sites at Siltcoos. So we've zoomed out a little bit, but this is still just carbon density. This is how much carbon is in a square meter or a cubic meter of the dune as we move from the toe to the back. This is still just a density estimate, not stock measurement. And so one of the things that we do to estimate the stock is to say the carbon density we found at the crest of the dune, for example, how much volume of the dune do we multiply that density by? What's the appropriate volume of the dune? This is what, with those profiles we get, we can calculate the overall volume of the dune and which portion of that is relevant to what we found at the crest or at the heel. And so basically what we did was found ways to break up the volume of the dune into relevant sort of ecological sections to say, well, the carbon density we found at the core, at the crest of the dune up here, we're going to multiply that density by this area here, the volume sort of in this bin, because the grass had really similar characteristics in the above ground in that portion. And we're gonna, the toe is gonna be this portion of the volume, and we're gonna multiply the carbon density from that core by this sub-volume of the dune, and then sort of add all those together to get an estimate of how much carbon is actually at each of these transects. And so this is finally showing carbon stock. This is kilograms of organic carbon along the entire transect. So if you imagine a meter wide sliver that goes from the waterline up and over the dune all the way till you hit the forest, this is how much organic carbon is under that 1 meter wide line. And so we see here a really, really interesting thing in that there's generally not a ton of variation as you move from north to south, but except for this area in northern Oregon. So in the Clatsop Plains, just south of the Columbia River, the dunes there, if you all have ever been out, like the wreck of the Iredale ship or near Camp Riley or the town of Seaside, those dunes there are huge. Not only is the vegetation super dense, but the volume of the dunes there is massive. And so those two things multiplied together mean that we have a lot more carbon stored in those particular dunes than we generally see along the rest of the shoreline or along the rest of the coastline. One other thing that I've added to this graph is I've added in the driftwood component. And so in one of the earlier pictures I showed, you could see a log of driftwood sort of sticking out of the dune. And I talked about sometimes hitting those in our cores. I I didn't include them on the previous graphs because the carbon that we'd see in the driftwood isn't necessarily related at all to what the grasses are doing and how they're growing. But it's really interesting to see where we did hit driftwood, and I know it's very patchy. It makes up a huge portion of the carbon at those sites. And so something that I'm thinking about definitely is how much carbon in dunes is actually a result of, in the formation of those dunes, driftwood getting buried and slowly decaying over time. And so that was another really interesting sort of finding in this work as well. To do a little bit of a comparison, I've just picked 8 of the transects that I did, sort of moving north to south again. I wanted to compare them to other measurements of carbon storage in dunes from other places. Unfortunately, one of my prior lab mates, Dr. Katya J., I helped her do really similar work in the Outer Banks of North Carolina, where we were basically had a very similar experimental design and looked at a number of places in the dunes of North Carolina. And wasn't able to plot them together. It's a different data set, but I've scaled the axes here to be identical. And so what you can see is there is 2 to 3 times more carbon per unit area in the dunes out here than North Carolina. And we generally have more carbon in the sediment itself. So like the yellow bars here make up a higher proportion of the total carbon in each site than in North Carolina, where more of it is in the below ground biomass. And that's kind of interesting to see, but again, a reflection of the global extent of dunes. If we're thinking about understanding dunes as a globally relevant ecosystem, that's something we want to understand carbon storage of at a much broader scale. There's clearly going to be variation. And one of the things that we think is causing this difference between the Northwest and the Outer Banks of North Carolina is, again, sort of those 2 big components. The grasses out here are wildly more productive. There's just higher densities, higher biomass of grass, et cetera. So there's more productivity in this system than what we see in North Carolina. And also our dunes are a lot bigger. The volume of the dunes, the length of our transects here before you get to forest are much, much larger than what we see in North Carolina. Another part of that, at least anecdotally, is I went to North Carolina like maybe 4 times to help with that project. And every time we went, there was another hurricane that had just destroyed a lot of the grasses there. And so it's a little bit hard to make that comparison, but there's so much disturbance in those ecosystems, at least nowadays, that it's hard for those grasses to actually establish and get to a higher stem density or to achieve more biomass in the same amount of area. So that's really interesting to see. Finally, I want to compare this a little bit to other ecosystems in general. So sort of scaling up the carbon density that I found at my transects from kilograms of carbon per meter squared to tons of organic carbon per hectare. This red line is reflecting how much we see in coastal dunes. There we go, the laser pointer, it's really hard to see. And so it's definitely less than we see in terrestrial forests. It's less than we see in mangroves, but it's still a pretty high number. So generally 50 to 100 metric tons per hectare. And that's really, really consistent with the numbers or the figures we see in terrestrial grasslands. So prairies or wild grasslands around the world. The range that we're seeing in these grassy dunes is really, really similar to what we see in other types of grasslands, which again is an important thing for us to think about, especially with the global scale that vegetated dunes take up around the world. And finally, I want to leave with like a little bit of a conceptual exercise, not around fire danger, but thinking about carbon storage with sort of these two mechanisms of how much productivity is in this ecosystem and sort of what is the size, what's the volume that we're looking at a particular site. And so I just want to use this sort of as a conceptual little bit of information for y'all to chew on next time you're walking along the beach or you're hiking along the dunes. Sort of look at this and think about an ecosystem service that maybe you haven't spent a lot of time thinking about. And generally that's where there is low vegetation density or biomass and where there's low dune volume, there's going to be lower carbon storage there. And where there is more vegetation, higher density, higher biomass, where there's a larger dune volume, we're going to see higher carbon stocks there. Again, this extreme category though is relative to what you would see in other grassy ecosystems. So just to give you a little bit of an image of what the variation in dunes look like throughout the Pacific Northwest coastline, this is one site in Siltcoos, Oregon, sort of down south, where it's unmanaged, meaning the Ammophila has had free range for many decades. And it's a very large dune that goes back hundreds of meters. And the forest is now sort of encroaching and moving seaward in that process of ecological succession. So however much carbon is there under the grasses is probably only going to increase as more woody and shrubby vegetation grows in that way and fills in that way. And so this is a site that has potentially really high carbon storage and potentially high carbon storage into the future as the grasses sort of act as one of those earlier successional plants, stabilizing the dune, building up organic matter to allow larger and larger species to sort of fill in that space. To make a hard 180, this is a picture at Pacific City. Again, I showed images of sort of the level of development that's occurred along that strip of Pacific City. So here's a place where we're going to see, very little organic carbon because there's hardly any vegetation and the dune is tiny. The houses are built straight up to the beach, so there's not really room there for grasses to even grow. There's a lot of interesting management strategies happening there that I'm happy to talk about later, but won't get into right now if you have questions about it. There are policies that require planting of these grasses in front of some of these structures if they grade or if they try different management strategies. And so there's a lot of interesting implications there, but as it is, very low carbon. This is a little bit further north in Nehalem Bay. This is one of those habitat restoration areas I was talking about, where the idea here is to create habitat to try to plant and restore the yellow and pink sand verbena or to create habitat for western snowy plovers. So this area is probably also going to have really low carbon because the vegetation's been removed and they've graded the dune down to a much lower volume. Interestingly, we often find that at these places where they've graded the dune down and the elevation of the dune is lower, we tend to hit more driftwood in those sites. And I'm not convinced that's because there's more driftwood there, but because in the process of dune formation, right, that driftwood that was deposited there however many decades ago, that gives some sort of substrate for the sand to start piling around and sort of aids the process of dune formation. But then as the grasses grow and the dune gets really tall, as we core down, we're only going through, those most recent decades of dune growth. But when they bulldoze all that down and bring the elevation back to right on top of that driftwood, we hit a lot more driftwood in those sites. So that's something that's really interesting to think about as well. But in terms of grass, probably lower carbon storage at those sites. Back to Pacific City, there's a lot of development here as well, obviously, but there is still this really large, densely vegetated grassy dune. And here you can see it's scarping. Scarping is basically where you look at the profile of a dune and imagine that it looks like half domed, right? Just like a cliff right off the front there. And this is clearly a consequence of erosion at this particular place. But thinking into the future, even if there is a lot of carbon stored in that dune, it's got a lot of volume, there's dense vegetation, you can see all of the roots and rhizomes that have been exposed as this dune gets eroded. You can see the roots and rhizomes that go basically straight down to the elevation of the beach. It's there all the way down. As a consequence of erosion or of large tidal events that we're going to see, like at king tides when you have really, really high water, or over a longer term, if we think about sea level rise, what's going to happen to the carbon storage in these ecosystems if they're not allowed to retreat back because of this development. So sort of thinking about ecosystem services more in the long term in that way as well. And the human management decisions that we make that could impact that. So we're getting basically to the end of my talk. Again, everything I just shared today was sort of just chapter 1 of my dissertation, some things that I'm looking into now but won't be able to share much about until my hopeful defense next summer, is looking into the relationship between dune carbon storage and the type and density of vegetation, to do sort of more analyses there, to look more at patterns in latitude, depth, and sand supply. So places where there's been a lot of erosion versus a lot of accretion, places where there's just deposition of sand to the beaches in general, to see at those places, do we see more or less carbon storage? To actually measure sequestration rates through a couple of experiments that I've been doing. One of them, actually, many of you probably saw. There was a bag experiment out here at Hatfield the last 2 years that my former lab mate, Dr. Rebecca Mostow, was doing. And so I was taking some carbon measurements from those samples as well. Thinking about these comparisons of carbon storage in the habitat restoration areas versus the unmanaged dunes. And then finally, the impacts of climate change on dune carbon storage. So if any of this was interesting or you have more questions about it, or just want to see more pictures of sandy roots and driftwood, please come find me in a few months, and hopefully I'll have more to share on these topics. I want to thank first and foremost the dunes and grasses. I spent a lot of time out on the beach. It's a wonderful place to work. I learned a lot, had so much fun, and I'm really grateful to have had the opportunity to spend time in these landscapes. I want to thank my advisor, Dr. Sally Hacker, and one of my committee members, Dr. Peter Ruggiero, in the College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Science, who's been really helpful in sort of completing these projects. And all of the current and former lab mates and undergrads and field techs that have helped dig so many holes and extrude so many cores, and just gave a lot of time of their lives just rolling around in the sand with me and bringing their positive attitudes. So I really appreciate that as well. I also want to thank the funding sources, NSF and NOAA, for helping fund a lot of this work, and I'm happy to take any questions that you have.
Great presentation. Questions in the room? We'll go with you first.
Great talk, thank you. I guess my question is looking at that carbon sequestration graphs that you were showing with the bars. Yeah, with these, do you think there's an argument to be made to not get rid of all of the invasive plants if they're doing a good job sequestering carbon with climate change worries? Or is there more of a push now than ever to bring back native plants?
Yeah, that is, do I need to repeat the question for Zoom folks, or can they hear that? Okay, that's a great question, thank you. And I guess a couple of things there. One is that I'm talking about one ecosystem service among many, and so there's always competing interests for, like, we want to create plover habitat, or we want to restore, pink sand verbena. This is not something that people are really thinking about at all, as far as I can tell, in terms of coastal dunes. And to be clear, I'm not advocating that we should get more of these non-native plants, just pump them into the dunes and fix carbon. And part of the reason for that is as much carbon as this is, the problem of climate change is not a result of people mining the carbon out of dunes and releasing it to the atmosphere. It obviously comes from other sources and from other sectors of our economy and of industrialization. So I don't know that I would make the case that we should be, trying to keep more of them here. I think it's definitely something to consider, just as a reality of what has happened from almost 100 years of these plants being here. They're so widespread that there's really nowhere that I've seen or that I'm aware of in Oregon or Washington where these grasses haven't already fundamentally changed the ecosystem. At these habitat restoration areas, it's sort of we're trying to get back to something like it would have been, but these areas are it's maybe a few hundred meters of beach, and then on either side it's just giant dunes again covered in grass. And so the scale it would take to even try to remove at a large scale is something that I don't currently see as a priority for a lot of agencies, just because it's a daunting task. And so I guess how I see my role in this is helping us understand an ecosystem service that we might not have thought about in this ecosystem before, and just balance that with the other services that we're currently managing for. I don't know if that answers your question.
Online.
So two now. Cheryl Strong asks, thanks for mentioning those trade-offs, John. With sea level rise and those grasses, the native plant and plovers have little room. Great talk. Sorry, that wasn't a question yet. John Chapman, maybe is a question. Great presentation. You mentioned this, but did you quantify age of dune sites individually with carbon storage? Is the carbon in mostly passing through? Or once it is there, can it become older?
Yeah, just to make sure I understand the question, asking, have I looked into how much carbon is in a dune and sort of how old that dune is or how long it's been there, and trying to understand, is this carbon sort of being fixed and then immediately decomposing and leaving the system, or is it actually staying, is it being stored in the dune long term? Is that the question that they're asking?
I think so, but John, do you want to qualify anyway? You can just type in more if you like. Yes.
Yes, okay. I'll answer that question then. It's a great question. Thank you for asking it. And I guess my response right now is that there are ways that we can look into that. In the dunes, there are studies that have looked at like aerial photography. And so you'll know, when grass is established at this exact part of the dune and how long it's been since then and how much carbon is there. And so we can sort of, with enough of those samples, sort of build some sort of timeline of like how much carbon gets stored in dunes or gets fixed in dunes over time. And so that's something that we absolutely can do. It's something I'm looking into right now, but don't have a clear answer for you to be able to answer that question. Like, how long does it take for the carbon to build up and how long does it stay there? I don't have answers to that right now, but it's definitely something I'm looking into for one of my second chapters. And the second component of that was, how long does the carbon stay there? And I think that's a question that would be a little harder to answer, I think, especially with the cores only going a meter down. We definitely do see, like again, with the scarped dunes, if you can just sort of see at that point of erosion that there are roots and rhizomes that go way down there. If those were, the original ones that got buried a long time ago, or if it's sort of new growth, I'm not really sure. But it's a great question. And I think one clear thing is that there is at least carbon that stays there over time, is that there's as the organic matter accumulates in those soil horizons, especially at the back of the dune, as you transition towards a forest, the carbon generally only continues to increase, and maybe at some level will sort of level off. But I don't think in these systems we're at that point yet.
Other questions in the room? Online? Great, because I have a question.
Okay.
Great presentation. I'm curious, could you elaborate a little bit more on the blue carbon input?
Yeah, is there a particular?
Could you just elaborate more on what that blue carbon input is?
Yeah, maybe I'll back up a little bit too, in sort of what part of my thinking was when I got into this project. If I can find that slide so long ago, past all the holes references. Here we go. Yeah, so part of my thinking when I got into this project was thinking about the carbon storage in other coastal ecosystems where you have, this pretty rapid, in some places, rapid accumulation of sediment and really high levels of organic matter in a salt marsh or in an estuary, where when people do cores in those systems, it might be 80% organic matter. Really, really high proportion of that sediment is organic matter. And obviously I knew it wouldn't be that high in sand because it's sand and there are physical and chemical properties that sort of restrict the amount of organic matter that will build up there. But part of the thinking there, right, is that as organic matter or debris from rivers comes out into the oceans, or primary productivity from the oceans themselves, contribute a lot of that carbon into eelgrass beds, and sort of the studies that look at what fraction of the organic carbon stored in an estuary is carbon that was produced right here in this estuary versus carbon that was sort of imported or brought in. And it's a pretty significant portion at many sites around the world, at least for estuaries or for other coastal ecosystems. And so part of my question there is, all the sand that's delivered to these beaches from the ocean and then gets blown into the dunes, is there carbon on that at all? Are there small pieces of organic matter mixed in there? And so that was sort of part of my thinking in doing this project here. And one interesting thing that we see is that I didn't talk about it or show it here on these graphs, but I also did, not a core, but did collect sand samples sort of at the high water line and somewhere halfway along the beach before we get to the toe of the dune. And we generally see a higher proportion of that sediment that's organic matter on the beach. And then it drops off again, like it might be around an average value of like 1% organic matter in the sand right there on the beach. And then as you get to the toe, it gets to maybe 0.5%, it's lower. And then as soon as you get to the crest and beyond, it jumps up again as a result, of all the grasses growing there and bringing that in. And so I don't have like a clear answer of how much, carbon that comes in on the sand actually stays there. It almost makes me think that the carbon that's on the sand at the beach, because it starts a little bit higher and then drops off at the toe, is either respired or sort of leaves the system already by the time it gets to the dune, or is otherwise such a small amount relative to the amount contributed by the plants that it's sort of hard to measure that portion. That's a great question, though. Thank you.
So with that in mind, do you see any signatures or patterns related to our coastal beaches and the outlets of coastal river mouths?
That's another great question. I haven't looked into that specifically yet. There is one interesting part. A former lab mate of mine did a survey of rack deposition across the Pacific Northwest. Vanessa Constant. She finished her PhD a few years ago and was looking at sort of the proximity of river outlets and the type of ecosystem there, whether it was kelp forests or estuaries and eelgrass beds, the types of rack that get deposited along the beaches, and was able to measure a pretty clear input of nitrogen into those places that were acting as sort of a fertilizer supplement to the grasses growing. And so that's one of the things that I have yet to look into or done yet, was to be able to take that data set and say, where we know that there's more rack being deposited in general, and where we know that it's bringing nutrients to help the grasses grow more, do we see more carbon storage or higher carbon sequestration at those sites because of this sort of nutrient subsidy we're getting near the mouths of the river. So something I'm going to look into, but I don't have an answer for you yet, which is a theme of, I think, a lot of the questions y'all have asked so far.
You got a year left, so that's that works. And then just a final, which is the transition from the back of the heel of these dunes into a coastal forest, or the succession. Has anyone looked at our coastal forest carbon content or carbon load in comparison to essentially what you've basically gathered around our dunes?
Yeah, as far as I know, no. I know there's a lot of folks at OSU in particular talking about like forest carbon storage generally. Coastal forest, though, I don't think so. It's one of the things that I sort of thought about in my early stages of my PhD, is how do we get a core, in those things. But the equipment of coring, because there's woody roots to go through, it would, the driftwood was just shattering my cores. And so like, I think being able to sort of carry over the methods was a big jump for me to do in one PhD. But as far as I know, from sort of looking into that early on, there aren't people who are sort of looking at those estimates specifically for coastal forests, which often are characterized by pretty different vegetation than what we would see in the Coast Range or in the Cascade forests.
Thank you. It sounds like a good collaboration with someone in the College of Forestry. I think we have a question online.
Yeah, so this is from Francis Chan. So follow up to John Chapman's question on rates. Do you have a sense if carbon pool size and sequestration rates are correlated across systems, or is there a lot of orthogonality? So that smaller pool in dunes might not necessarily mean smaller rates.
Can you read the question again? That if there's...
Do you have a sense if carbon pool size and sequestration rates are correlated across systems, or is there a lot of orthogonality? So that smaller pools in dunes might not necessarily mean smaller rates.
I think I understand the question there being that if you already have some level of, let's say, some level of density or some amount of vegetation that's sequestering carbon actively, that the more vegetation you have there, the more living biomass there is, the higher your sequestration rate will be, because you're able to sort of capture more carbon there. And I would say generally, yes, that's probably true. I don't know in particular for the grasses of these dunes what that relationship would look like. But my general guess would be that it's a lower sequestration rate than what you would see maybe in a forest, because it seems like very little carbon's actually coming in on the sand. And so as grasses, there's not enough biomass there fixing carbon at a rate that you would see comparable to like a forest where, there's multiple layers of canopy, and where you have, where there's already that much living biomass, the sequestration rate will probably be quite a bit higher is my intuition on that. I hope that addresses Francis' question. If not, I'm sure he'll ask me more because he's on my committee.
Great. Well, do we have any more questions? No. Okay. Well, will you please join me in thanking John for a wonderful talk? And this concludes today's seminar. Thanks for coming out. And if you haven't signed on the form outside, please do so. And if you had a cookie, grab another one on the way out. Thank you.